Welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Bafis-Lasky. I'm the Manager of Patient Programs, Research and Advocacy at Lymphoma Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's educational webinar hosted by Lymphoma Canada on the topic of Canadian clinical trials and access for lymphoma patients. We appreciate those of you who have been able to join us live today to learn more about clinical trials and how they can provide access to novel and innovative therapies in Canada. This presentation will provide some important background information about clinical trials and the requirement in the drug review process in Canada, as well as information about how to access clinical trials and what to expect when you enroll in one. Now, before I go ahead and introduce today's speaker, there are just a couple of items to note. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Lymphoma Canada website later this evening. You will also receive an email by the end of day today with a link to the recording. This virtual software does not allow you to share your video or your microphone. Therefore, if you would like to ask a question, we just ask that you type the question into the questions box, which is located at the bottom of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. These questions will go to the moderator, which is myself for today, who will then ask these questions to our presenter at the end of the presentation, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. I would now like to begin to introduce and welcome today's speaker, Dr. Neil Berenstein. Dr. Berenstein is a professor of medicine at the University of Toronto and a practicing hematologist at the Odette Cancer Centre at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto. He has held numerous leadership positions in the field of oncology, including his role as the head of the hematology site group and founding director of the Advanced Therapeutics Program at the Odette Sunnybrook Cancer Centre. He was the program head for the cancer vaccine program at Sanofi Pasteur, and most recently has joined the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. Dr. Berenstein has a long-standing interest in cancer immunotherapy and continues to develop novel clinical strategies to augment anti-tumor immune responses to cancer. He has specific research interests in using genomic information to develop combination immunotherapy treatment approaches, and has a long track record in immunology and immunotherapy research, being a principal investigator and site lead for many lymphoma trials, and has published approximately 100 manuscripts in scientific and clinical journals. He dedicates his time and efforts to the lymphoma community through leading clinical investigations and research efforts. Thank you, Dr. Berenstein. I would now like to turn over the presentation to you.
Well, thank you very much, Caitlin. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss this topic of clinical trials, which I think all of us will agree this is a very relevant and important a topic for almost every patient and family who has experienced some form of cancer. This is and I'd like to start off by indicating that I have no disclosures that are relevant to this talk. This is an outline of what I'm going to cover today. We're going to leave time for questions at the end, and we welcome any questions that you can type in for us. We're going to talk today about the basics of clinical trials. I'm going to spend a few minutes at the beginning here talking about the types of trials and the timelines for trials, the value of clinical trials and how they have helped to produce significant treatment advances. I'm going to go over that in a minute. Responsibilities of the various parties in clinical trials. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the complexities of organizing clinical trials, because there's more than meets the eye for participating and initiating clinical trials. There are also a few positive features, many positive features of clinical trials. I'm going to talk about some of the limiting features of clinical trials. I will spend a few minutes in today's webinar talking about the correlation between advances in disease outcome and with novel drug and biologic families, and the importance of clinical trials in helping to advance these. We'll talk about strategies that are important to try to speed clinical development and drug approval. And some of these involve drug funding decisions, and some of these go beyond drug funding decisions. And then at the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about finding clinical trials, some practical advice on how you can find clinical trials that might be appropriate, and some useful resources in Canada. So that's what we'll cover in the next 30 or 40 minutes. And I'm just going to start off by trying to move this over here. So new drug development is a very complex process. And this whole process starts off in a lab somewhere where drugs are discovered. This can be in a university academic lab, it can be in a pharmaceutical company lab, but at some point there will be some possible new drug candidate that is identified by virtue of its effect on the biology of certain cells, certain cancer cells, and it is then that this entity is thought, well, maybe this will have some potential role as a cancer therapeutic. So the next stage after this early drug discovery is preclinical studies. And preclinical studies means studies before the clinic. These often involve murine models. And this new drug candidate is studied in these preclinical models. And eventually the models shift to human cellular models using human cancer cells or human xenograft models. And then finally, if this new drug candidate looks promising, it will be studied in what we call toxicology studies, where effects on larger animals is assessed before it goes into the clinic. And once this body of information, which can take, I've put here 3 to 6 years, it can take much longer, sometimes it can be accelerated, but this is before we even get to the clinic. Once there's a sufficient body of data that says, look, we have something here that looks promising, then the decision is made to go to the clinic. This requires getting formal approval by the regulatory agents. In Canada, a CTA, clinical trial agreement, is required. In the United States, an IND, an investigational new drug application, is submitted with all the information that has been acquired in the preclinical and drug discovery period of time. And also, as part of this package is the design or the plan for the clinical development. Now, the clinical development starts usually with a phase 1 clinical trial. Phase 1 clinical trials is often the first in man study of these new drug candidates. And in this type of study, the idea is to look at the toxicity and some of the biologic effects in patients with escalating doses. So, and in essence, to document what would be considered the maximum tolerated dose, and then to define what is the recommended phase 2 dose. So there's very careful documentation of all the toxicities that occur, and when the acceptable dose is found, this can then be moved into a phase 2 clinical trial. And the objective of the phase 2 clinical trial, which are usually larger trials involving perhaps hundreds of patients, the objective of this trial is to try to document the type of clinical activity that this type of molecule, this new drug candidate, can achieve. And it's usually, and sometimes it can be in various types of cancer, looking for the appropriate cancer where there's activity. Sometimes it's very focused on a particular cancer that the biology suggests would be relevant. Initially, the activity is documented as a monotherapy, as a single therapy, and eventually this new drug candidate may be combined with other drugs that are currently used for those types of cancers. And then once there is some documentation that clinical activity can be achieved at a safe dose, the next phase is phase 3, which is to demonstrate how this compares, how this molecule compares, either as a monotherapy or as a combination to standard of care treatment for that particular disease. So these are usually randomized trials. They're much larger. They can involve thousands of patients. They take a number of years, and these will determine in a very clear statistical fashion what the activity is and how it compares to the current standard of care. And if there are positive results from this series of clinical trials, a new drug application or NOC will be obtained from the regulatory agents, and this will then be available for potential use in the clinic. But the clinical evaluation doesn't stop there. usually there is further investigations and a real-world experience, further documentation of how the drug works and performs and behaves in the hands of your oncologists, hematologists in the everyday clinic. Now, this is a very detailed and time-consuming series of trials. I mentioned that there's a variable length of time before the new drug candidate gets into the clinic. Once the clinical development begins, it could take 6 years, it could take a little longer, it could take a little shorter before a positive clinical trial results are obtained. But then there's also a series of steps that need to take place before that drug can be used in the clinic. Health Canada approval is required. This can take 6 to 12 months. Once Health Canada approval is obtained, and Health Canada evaluates the drug for the efficacy, but also does very detailed evaluation of the manufacturing results and steps, and ensures that there is a good manufacturing process for this drug, and that it's that the drug is manufactured in a uniform and safe and consistent fashion. Once this Health Canada approval is obtained, the drug could be made available through patient support programs, which are usually sponsored by the pharmaceutical company that is involved in the drug development program. In order for the drug to be prescribed or marketed in Canada, it has to go through another series of steps. One is the CADTH or CADA, a review process, and the PCODER, which is the Canadian Oncology Drug Review process, which involves looking at the efficacy of the drug, comparing it to current drugs that are used for that indication, but going beyond the scientific analysis of the drug and also doing a very detailed economic review. Is the drug cost effective compared to drugs that are currently used in the clinic? And if there is a positive review from CADTH or PCODER, the next step is for the individual provinces. Now, the CADTH is a Canadian organization. Each province makes its own decisions on whether they are going to fund that new drug, and that process itself takes at least a half year, can take up to a couple of years. So you can see, even after a drug is approved by Health Canada, there's another 2.5 to 4 years for that drug to become funded by one of the provinces, at which time the drug will be broadly available within the province for the specific indication that it has been developed, or that it has been approved. Now, I'm going to show you a few slides that discuss the value of this whole clinical trial process. And this is the reason I'm showing you these slides are that this group at the George Washington School of Business conducted a survey of clinical trial patients who have participated in clinical trials to understand why they participate in clinical trials, and actually would they do it again. And so clinical trials are needed to make sure that new medical approaches are safe and effective for the human body. That's what that very detailed series of clinical trials, phase 1 to 3 clinical trials, are designed to do. They also contribute to the overall advancement of medicine, establishing which strategies or treatment work best in certain groups of people for specific illnesses. And these clinical trials can be the result of years of research, which I tried to emphasize, the preclinical research and laboratory tests and fund sourcing and administrative applications that are required to identify this new drug candidate. And I want to just spend 1 minute here before I go further on this survey that this George Washington group conducted, and just going into even the complexities of starting a new trial. So this is after the preclinical development, but even one simple trial, phase 1 trial, phase 2 trial, there are a whole series of steps that need to take place. First, the scientist who developed this drug, or who led the identification of this new drug candidate, usually is not a clinician. Sometimes there are clinician scientists, but usually they're a scientist and they're trained in basic science. They have to pair up or identify investigators or clinician investigators, sometimes cooperative groups, and sometimes pharmaceutical companies that are interested in helping to develop this new drug or taking it to the clinic. So that can involve presenting data at various scientific meetings and identifying the right group of colleagues to try to move this entity into the clinic. And once this group is identified, together they will put together what's called a trial synopsis. So this is sort of the plan for clinical development, what they're going to try to achieve, how they're going to achieve it, the design of an initial clinical trial. And this will go round and round with many concept refinements amongst these different stakeholders in this clinical team. It will be important to acquire funding. Now, if this is a new drug candidate is of interest to a pharmaceutical company, that pharmaceutical company or biotech company may provide the funding. Sometimes it's necessary to get peer-reviewed funding. Anytime funding is involved, there will be legal agreements, and then that funding will be used for various aspects of the trial, and detailed trial budget has to be produced. At this point, a full clinical trial protocol needs to be created. Clinical trial protocol can be 100 pages. It describes all of the important details of the clinical trial. What is the objective of the clinical trial? What are the endpoints that one's trying to achieve? What is the patient population that will be included and what patients will be excluded? What is the design? How to document toxicity? What samples will be taken? When will imaging be performed? Et cetera, et cetera. Everything is defined very, very carefully and precisely in this full clinical protocol. There has to be agreement on who will take the legal responsibility. Is it the clinician, scientist? Is it the pharmaceutical company? Is it the cooperative group? It could be any of those. But this becomes a very legally important agreement because the sponsor is the group or the person that will be interacting with the regulatory authorities. It's necessary to secure regulatory approval. In Canada, that's Health Canada, and Health Canada has stipulated, has made it essential that all trials that are conducted in Canada need to go through a human subject review board. So there's two different regulatory boards that need, at least two, that need to approve this type of trial, a new trial. And then there's all sorts of other documents, trial manuals, lab manuals, pharmaceutical manuals, statistical analytical plan that need to be generated. If sometimes a trial can be done at one site, sometimes it needs multiple sites. If the disease is not that common, one has to then find other sites and enlist investigators and get them involved. There are legal aspects to this. There's feasibility aspects. Does the site have enough patients to be useful in this type of trial? All trials have to be registered at clinicaltrials.gov, and that's another step that needs to be completed before the trial can be started. And then one has to start the trial. One has to accrue the patients, collect the data, obtain the samples that are going to be analyzed to get the x-rays and imaging studies done, and sometimes study amendments are required. One has to go back to Health Canada. And then finally, when all this is done, one has a whole bunch of data that needs to be analyzed, and reports have to be generated and publication. So this is just for one trial, one simple phase 1 or phase 2 trial. Every trial needs to go through this whole series of events. So you can understand that these are very complex entities. So again, phase 1 trials usually are successful and go forward. 70% will move forward into the next phase. They usually involve relatively small number of patients. They can last several months to a year, sometimes a little longer. And the whole idea is to define the safety and the appropriate dose to move forward into the next stage. Phase 2 can involve hundreds of patients trying to document efficacy and side effects. These can last from 1.5 to 2 years, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. Now, not all new drug candidates are going to be successful. They may look really good in preclinical studies, but when it comes into the clinic, either toxicities or there will be insufficient efficacy, or it won't hit its biologic target in the clinic. And so only about 1/3 of these new drug candidates that get to phase 2 will actually be successful and go into phase 3. And there are variations on phase 2 trials, as I mentioned. There can be monotherapy trials, or you could combine them with other agents that look promising either from preclinical studies or that are currently used for standard of care. Phase 3 is to compare this to standard of care for the disease. These are bigger trials. They can involve thousands of patients, and they last several years. And the number I have in my mind is 1 in 10 will be successful. These trials are expensive. These trials can cost millions of dollars. A phase 2 trial might cost a couple $1 million. A phase 3 trial could cost $25 to $50 million, believe it or not. And not all of these, as I said, are successful. And then once a drug is approved based upon a phase 3 study, there are phase 4 requirements often, where in the community these drugs are studied in huge numbers of patients to make sure or to identify any very low frequency toxicities or effects that may occur. In Canada, this whole process is regulated by Health Canada and the USA by the FDA. They oversee the rules and regulation for all clinical trials. They define them. They create the rules for new drugs, biologic products, or any devices. And they have already mandated for many years that all clinical trials are monitored and reviewed by institutional review boards, IRBs. And boards, IRBs, are made up of members of the community, statisticians, physicians, who help to make sure that the clinical trial is ethical. So and this is very important. It wouldn't make sense to spend all this time and effort and resources on a trial that isn't ethical. And the IRBs protect the welfare and rights of its participants, and it ensures that any risks or potential toxicities are reasonable when compared to the possible benefits. So what are the values of clinical trial? Well, obviously, the first potential value is that a patient who takes a part in a clinical trial may benefit by the actual treatment, may be given a treatment that isn't currently available commercially. And if it works, they'll be one of the first to benefit from it, and will have benefited from it perhaps years. As I showed you the timelines, if you get this drug in a phase 1 trial or a phase 2 trial, and if eventually it's approved, you may have it half dozen years or many years before it is available for the rest of the population. If they're not given the new treatment, if a patient is not given a new treatment and they're in the placebo or control arm, they still will receive the standard of care. And this is where the IRBs make sure that studies are ethical and that patients never receive anything less than what is currently considered a standard of care for that particular disease. So they still will get what is currently the best treatment. Patients will still get the best treatment that's available. And in addition, they will also receive the support from a team of experts who are involved in the clinical trial with very precise imaging and lab testing and delivery of the treatment. But another very important benefit, which can't be minimalized, is being able to help researchers discover the effectiveness of new treatment approaches, which may eventually benefit others down the road. So basically assisting new drugs being developed to be made available for the general population that needs it in the future. So this is the very simple study or survey that this George Washington group did, and this was called Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered Force. They interviewed a number of people who had taken part in at least one clinical research study and found that the major influencing factors were these two factors, that the possibility that 82% said that they were motivated to participate in the clinical trial because it would help them, and 78% said that they were motivated because it could possibly help their family and others down the road. And 93% of patients found that they would, or indicated that they would participate in the clinical research trial again. Only less than 1% said that they wouldn't, and the rest were unsure. So that's a pretty positive assessment of this of clinical trials, of the value of clinical trials. But to present a balanced view, there are some downsides of randomized controlled clinical trials. Randomized controlled clinical trials are the gold standard. They provide the highest level of evidence regarding the efficacy and toxicities of new treatments. And practically all of the standard of care that we have for hematologic malignancies and cancers in general come from randomized controlled clinical trials. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, they come from randomized controlled clinical trials. So as I pointed out, randomized to get to and to complete a randomized controlled clinical trial, it is time consuming. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. There's extra testing because one has to very precisely document the effects of these clinical, of the new drug candidate. It's expensive, as I mentioned, very, very expensive. And then one could say, well, is it ethical to only offer half of the patients or 2/3 of the patient in a randomized controlled clinical trial the new treatment? As I pointed out, everyone receives the current best treatment that is available at that time point. Positive features of randomized controlled clinical trial: access to new treatment years ahead of the general population, potentially enhanced efficacy, improved toxicity, optimal treatment, and more precise disease monitoring in any clinical trial. And it contributes to advances in standard of care for the next generation. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about this. Have there been advances in standard of care in hematologic malignancies? I know you're all interested in this question. So what I've done here is produced a series of slides which address this. This is a slide that comes from Canadian Cancer Registry, Canadian Cancer Registry, and it shows the 5-year age-adjusted net survival between two periods, 1992 and 1994, and 2012 and 2014, for a number of different cancers. And it shows the percent change between these two periods, which are separated by about 20 years. And you can see that there is, for example, for chronic lymphocytic leukemia, there is a 14% improvement in the 5-year age standardized net survival. For non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, there's a 20%. For multiple myeloma, there's a 16.8%. These are big changes in 5-year age standardized survival. I'm going to show this in another way, in a little bit more detail here. But this is chronic lymphocytic leukemia that we're focusing in on, and this shows the survival curves for patients between the era of 1989 to 1995. So that's this low curve here, this, I guess, green color curve. And then the most current interval or period between 2009 and 2016. And these are just different ages of the patients who are studied. And you can see for all age groups, the more current patients who underwent treatment for chronic lymphocytic leukemia, the more current period of time, have significantly better survival curves than they did 20 years ago. And this is because of what's shown on this slide, which is the development in clinical trials and the approval of basically new drugs, starting off with chlorambucil, but there have been randomized trials of purine analogs, chemoimmunotherapy, meaning Rituxan-based chemotherapy or bemarituzumab-based chemotherapies, and more recently the P13 kinase inhibitors, the BTK inhibitors, which are only more recently being used regularly. So we expect to see even greater improvements in survival in the years to come, and the BCL2 inhibitors, venetoclax. So again, the improvements in outcome are associated with clinical trials which have resulted in the approval of these different new families of drugs. Same here for follicular lymphoma. You can see the improvement in 5-year survival curves here. We have the study of Rituxan-based chemotherapy, randomized trials where, again, half patients got a Rituxan chemo and half didn't get Rituxan chemo, and showing significant improvements in outcome in those who got Rituxan chemo, and maintenance therapy afterwards, then new treatment with bendamustine, and then new monoclonal antibodies and new targeted agents and even new immunotherapy molecules that are only now starting to have an impact on survival. Myeloma has been another huge success story. You can see here the doubling, almost a doubling, or actually more than a doubling of the 5-year survival rates between 2000 and 2021 as multiple trials, and there have been all sorts of randomized trials conducted, which have resulted in new drug development for lenalidomide, the IMiDs, proteasome inhibitors, and more recently the monoclonal antibodies, the anti-CD38s, now more recently CAR therapies and other immune therapies. So all of these new therapies have been developed from clinical trials. None of them have been approved or used, and they have been responsible for these improvements in outcome, which are benefiting all the generations that come after the trials are performed. So one of the questions is, how can we speed clinical development? As I pointed out, the preclinical and clinical development takes approximately 9 to 13 years. So the regulatory agents have realized that this is a very important, that cancer is a very important disease, hematologic cancer is very important, and have looked at this whole clinical trial process and have put in certain mechanisms to help speed development. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these in the next few minutes. In Canada, the important mechanisms are priority of review and NOC/C. In the United States, there's been fast track design, breakthrough, priority reviews, and accelerated approval, and then there's an approvals across multiple countries. All of these are mechanisms that have been put in place to help those who conduct the clinical trials, the investigators, the clinicians, the pharmaceutical companies, develop their drugs quicker. So priority review. Priority review status in Canada may be granted to drug submissions intended for the treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of serious, life-threatening, or severely debilitating illness, where there is no existing drug on the Canadian market with the same profile, or where the new drug represents a significant advance. I left out the word advance there. And the priority review assigns eligible submissions and a shortened review target of 180 days in comparison to 300 days for non-priority. So basically, the Health Canada's review time is guaranteed to be as short as is possible and is allowed, 6 months. There is also another very important mechanism, which is called NOC with conditions. So notice of compliance means that you do have a successful new drug application, and it's again intended to speed access to potential breakthroughs in serious life-threatening or debilitating diseases by conditionally approving promising drugs that have not yet definitively demonstrated clinical efficacy. So these are drugs where the clinical trial process can be shortened, because rather than rating for survival for an endpoint, one can use surrogate endpoints, which could be progression-free survival, it could be some sort of biologic endpoint, some biomarker, and but sponsors will make the written undertaking to carry out studies to confirm the clinical benefit and subsequent trials after the drug is approved in a timely fashion. This is very important. In the US, all of these types of mechanisms are in place. There's fast track, where there's more frequent meetings and more frequent written communications between the sponsor and the health and the regulatory agency. And there's what's called a rolling review. So you don't have to wait to the end of the clinical trial to start submitting your data to the FDA for your final new drug application. There's breakthrough therapy, where it's possible to use, again, other clinically significant endpoints that might take less time. Priority review, again, reviewing within 6 months rather than a longer period of time, and then accelerated approval, where there's again the surrogate endpoint. So these different processes in Canada and the United States are pretty similar, and the whole intent here is to speed clinical development, so new drugs are approved faster through the same clinical trials, but where there is very good, strong data from data that many would say are just as relevant. Progression-free survival, if you have significant improvements in progression-free survival, patients staying in remission longer, that in itself is important, even if it has not yet been proven to be associated with the overall survival. So with that, there are a lot of roles and responsibilities from the different stakeholders and players that participate in clinical trials. So first, we have the sponsor and the CRO. So the sponsor, as I mentioned, is responsible for the design and organization, the initiation, management of the trial per good clinical practice. The sponsor appoints the investigators, files all the regulatory documents and all the safety reports. The sponsor can be the clinician, it can be the cooperative group, it can be the pharmaceutical company, it can be someone appointed by any of those. And then there's the funder. The funder may be the same as the sponsor, but the funder may be different. It may be, funding may come from peer review support, may come from other sources, but they usually they're very closely associated. Now, as I mentioned, the sponsor is responsible for appointing the principal investigator. Principal investigator, there's a global principal investigator for multi-center trials, for phase 3 trials, and this global principal investigator oversees the clinical trial globally, is responsible for the clinical recruitment and adhering to the protocol and reporting data, and the principal investigator often is responsible for recruiting other investigators if multiple sites are involved. As I mentioned, the regulatory agencies are very, very important. There are two major regulatory agencies that we've talked about here in North America, Health Canada and the FDA, lead the regulatory system. In other words, they created the regulatory system that all trials must follow, and they've implemented this IRB process where all trials must go through the local university or clinical center IRB, REB review. And then there's the patient. And many may say the patient is the most important cog in this wheel here. And the patient consents and agrees to participate and follow the clinical trial procedures as per the protocol. And this is a very important point because it's very important that the patient understand the clinical trial and what they're getting into, because it is a little bit more detailed and involved in many times than standard clinical care treatment. Now, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just to say that for each clinical trial, there is a study schedule, a schedule of events, it's called, that is created as part of the clinical protocol that is used to define when each different event will take place. When will the drugs be administered? When will various blood tests be obtained? When will treatments be given? When will various imaging be performed? And it's important to have this information when you agree to participate in a clinical trial. If you don't live close to the center where you're participating, some of these extra tests may be problematic. Sometimes there aren't that many extra tests. Sometimes there are. You have to be really motivated and willing to participate, because one thing that doesn't work very well is if one decides after beginning in the trial that it's too difficult to participate. That's always acceptable. But the problem is that one has then sort of taken a clinical trial spot away from someone who could have participated. So that's something that is not ideal. So, and this information is available from any trial, from any investigator where you're contemplating a clinical trial. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about how do you find a clinical trial. Well, you have to speak to your oncologist or hematologist. Is there a trial for me? And usually it's best to do this before starting any new therapy. Once you're in the middle of a therapy, usually it's too late to start a clinical trial. Maybe for the next line of therapy, yes, but you really have to get into a clinical trial before there might be some effects from some other treatment that you're on. So you could check on the center website. Are there any clinical trials? You can check on other center websites. You can ask your oncologist or hematologist, are they aware of any clinical trials? If there are clinical trials at another center, it's perfectly fair to ask to be assessed at that other center for that clinical trial. In order to find a clinical trial, you have to know the details of your illness. You have to know the exact diagnosis. You can't say I have leukemia. You have to know what kind of leukemia. Is it chronic? Is it acute? Is it lymphocytic? Is it myelogenous? Is it newly diagnosed? Is it recurrent? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to know the stage of your illness. You have to know your treatment history and also other illnesses that could affect your acceptance into a trial. If you've had a diagnosis of another cancer in the last year, that may prevent you from getting into a cancer. If you have serious comorbid illnesses that may make it difficult to receive some of the new drug candidates or the study treatments, that may also prevent your acceptance into a trial. So it's very important to have all of these details when you start looking for clinical trials. Nowadays, searching online is a very good way of finding clinical trials. And I'm going to show you some of the sites that are available and that could be used to identify clinical trials that may be appropriate for you. Clinicaltrials.gov is very important. In Canada, we have the Canadian Clinical Trials Group, and I'm going to show you some of those trials on the hematology site group. Google can also be very useful. And then there are some disease support foundations, Lymphoma Canada, and I'm going to show you the new clinical trial web page that Lymphoma Canada is adding or has added to their website. And there are others that can be used depending upon the exact diagnosis that you have. Myeloma Canada, etc. Waldenstrom Foundation, we'll talk about those in a minute. So clinicaltrials.gov, as I mentioned, every trial in North America, Canada, and the United States has to be registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And you just put clinicaltrials.gov into your web browser, and you will get this page that I have right here. And then what you can do is just enter your disease or your condition. You can put other terms, like you could put untreated or relapsed or recurrent. You can put in what country you want to make sure that you find clinical trials in. And then there's advanced searches. So I haven't shown that here, but you can click on advanced search and you could put phase 1, you could put phase 2, phase 3. There's all sorts of different terms that you can put. If you wanted immune therapy, you could put immune therapy in that. So this is a very good website. And once you put in, now I just put in here Follicular Lymphoma Canada. And I came up with 2 trials that are, and I put actively recruiting. So not trials that are about to recruit or trials that have finished recruiting. And these are the 2 trials, one with adalasib, one with ibrutinib, and one's a randomized controlled trial with a placebo. And so these are trials that you would have identified if you'd used clinicaltrials.gov, and you can click on these different links here and find out the exact trials. Actually, you click on this link here and you get more details, all the details. Usually it shows you the inclusion criteria, exclusion, the objectives of the trial, and important details like that. This is the Canadian Cancer Trials Group website, and you can, again, put Canadian Cancer Clinical Trials Group or Trials Group in your browser. You'll come up with this website. Then you can put in hematologic disease site in that website. And in fact, you can even pick the type of disease you want. But I did this and I accumulated all the currently active recruiting clinical trials for hematologic malignancies in Canada right now. These are them. And you can click on any of these to get more information on these trials. And this changes all the time, but this shows you that this would identify various types of trials. And these are usually go under various abbreviations, Hodgkin's disease, lymphoma, etc. Lymphoma Canada. So this is our sponsor, today's sponsors, meetings sponsors, webinar sponsors website. And it has all sorts of important information that you can find from this website. And now there's a link to finding clinical trials. and perhaps Caitlin or others from Lymphoma Canada could discuss some more of this later. And there are other websites that can be used. There are many websites, and many of them do provide information, and also information on clinical trials that are being conducted in Canada, which is what you probably are most interested in. So what I hope I've shown you this afternoon is that clinical development is complex. It's time consuming, it's expensive, but it is under very strict oversight by regulatory agencies, internal review boards, sponsors, and investigators to ensure patient safety and well-being, and to ensure that there is quality data that is obtained from the clinical trial. Advances in clinical care and standard of care are dependent upon clinical trials. And there are numerous mechanisms and agencies to help a patient or a family identify appropriate clinical trials in Canada or elsewhere. And what I've tried to show you is that participation in clinical trials may have multiple benefits, and is something that I personally would recommend whenever possible. So that's presentation today, and happy to address any questions or comments that any of you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Berenstein. That was a very informative presentation. We thank you very much for your detailed summary of the stages of clinical trial research, as well as providing more information about how to learn about trials and how specifically to access them in Canada. For those of you who had joined us live today, just a reminder that you can still type in your questions into the control panel on your screen, and we will read them out for Dr. Berenstein to answer. We do have some great questions already to get started with, so I'll just jump right into it. Our first question is related to access to a clinical trial if a location is not available close to you. So if there is a trial that a patient may be eligible for across the country or even in the US, are there any types of travel assistance programs through the government or through the trial itself to be able to access treatment, or possibly on the other end, having that treatment brought to a local hospital or center to receive it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult question, and there's not really a general answer. It often depends upon the details of the clinical trial and what has been included in the details of the clinical trial. There is no pan-government program that would provide for funding for moving to another province or country or United States to have clinical trials. I think that usually all of the costs of the clinical trial, the imaging, the drug costs, all the testing, blood tests, those are all covered by the clinical trial. So what we're really talking about is living expenses, and those are difficult. Some clinical trials may provide. I know that, for example, some clinical trials provide parking if you come from out of town. Some clinical trials do provide for overnight accommodation. Would they provide for you to spend 3 months or 6 months in another city? I mean, you have to really look into the details of the clinical trial. I think that unfortunately, there aren't government programs that I'm aware of that will provide you with that funding.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Berenstein. The next question we have is, what happens if a patient is on a clinical trial and they're responding well, but the trial closes because it met its objective or primary endpoint, for example? Will that patient still be able to receive the treatment if they're responding well to it?
Yeah, again, often these details are part of the clinical trial. And in some clinical trials, and they're included in the protocol, and there's something you can ask the investigator. Sometimes you can have a special request if you are having a good benefit from the trial, but the drug now stops. you can ask the sponsor to provide it. Usually the sponsor will do that. The whole idea of all of these trials is to help the individual patient. And in most trials, or many trials, it will say that patients can continue on the study drugs if they are benefiting even after trials close. But it is very trial independent, and I think that you could request that to happen if that is something that would be important. Yeah.
Okay, great, wonderful, thank you. Another question we have is if a patient finds a trial that they may be eligible for and they go to speak to their doctor about it, what's sort of that time length that it might take from presenting this to their doctor to actually undergoing maybe some tests to see if they are potentially eligible for the trial?
Yeah, so usually there's a screening period. So when a patient first approaches a center or an investigator for participation in the trial, the first thing is to see is the patient eligible for the trial. So that will be found by going over the details of the history and perhaps reviewing the pathology that's available and the treatment history. And then usually for a new trial, there's a number of screening tests, which might be, again, x-rays, might be certain tests on pathology or other tests. And usually there's a defined period. So, and usually that's around a month. It can be shorter in some trials, maybe a bit longer, depending upon what the tests or what the screening tests include. But it shouldn't be much longer than that. It's clearly recognized that cancer needs to be treated, and you can't delay the treatment of cancer. And the whole idea is to do all of the screening as quickly as possible. Sometimes the limiting factors are when can you book the CT scans and things like that, or the PET scans. And so there's usually a couple weeks, but there shouldn't be a prolonged period of time if the patient is appropriate for the trial.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. The next question we have is regarding any concerns while on a clinical trial. Is there anything in particular that a patient might not be allowed to do while on a trial in terms of exercise or any diet constraints? Or again, is that probably very specific to the trial itself?
Well, I would say I've never seen a trial that limits your ability to exercise. I think that most hematologists, oncologists will encourage exercise throughout treatments and throughout your course with cancer. It has been shown there's even been some clinical trials that have involved exercise, which have shown that exercise is beneficial. But the point is that there's sometimes some dietary restrictions because some of the newer drugs that we have, sometimes their metabolism can be altered with certain types of food. Usually they're very minimal restrictions. And I think the other restrictions might be just very common sense restrictions. If we know that blood counts are going to be low, we might want to avoid potential infectious environments, or if your platelets are low, you may want to avoid anything that can predispose to bruising and bleeding. But for the most part, everyday the activities of everyday living are usually not interfered with. In a trial.
That's great news. Wonderful.
The things that are, of course, is any other. I mean, we wouldn't want. I mean, most trials will prohibit you from taking other cancer drugs or treatments during the treatment. This has to all be very carefully monitored and discussed. We don't want something to confound the effects of the treatment that you're getting.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you for the clarity. Another question we have is, what exactly has the impact of COVID-19 been on clinical trials and recruitment at the beginning of the pandemic, and how is this still impacting clinical trials at this point in time?
Well, it has impacted clinical trials, unfortunately, and I can tell you from a personal perspective in some of the clinical trials that I've been involved with. So, for example, we've had sites that have actually closed the clinical trial accrual. during COVID. So only patients who are already on treatment were continued on treatment, so they wouldn't enter new patients. In some trials, so the accrual has decreased. And in fact, I think that what I've read is that accrual has decreased by as much as 50% during the period of time during to most clinical trials during the period of time during COVID. Now, I think we're coming out of COVID. I hope there's not a fourth wave anywhere, and I'm hoping that we'll get back to being able to get back to the same speed of accrual and open the trials that we need to have open. So yes, it has had an impact, unfortunately.
Okay, great. And just a second part to that question, has the pandemic sort of taught us anything about how to more effectively deliver a clinical trial? So might maybe virtual trials be an option at all in the future, or some kind of hybrid model?
That's a great question. And certainly our clinical care has changed a lot. Our standard of care, our standard clinical care has changed a lot with COVID, and we are doing a lot more virtual care. In some diseases, it's easy to do that because the management is often based upon patient's history and how patient is feeling and blood tests. In some diseases, it's more difficult because it's very important to see the patient and examine the patient and document what's happening with lymph nodes and things like that. And you would think that this could be translated to the clinical trial. And the thing is about clinical trials is that there is a higher level of documentation in most clinical trials. And there has to be some precision and verification. And so it's a little bit more difficult, but I think it is a model that could be followed for some types of clinical trials where the visits are perhaps reduced, and that could be more efficient for everyone involved.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. We have just, I think, about time for maybe two more questions. One of the questions that came in was regarding concern about going on a trial that may involve a placebo. Would you be able to provide a little bit more information about these types of trials, and are they seen in lymphoma, kind of in lymphoma trials?
Yeah, for sure. We've had many trials with placebo. I've participated in trials with placebo. Placebos are some of the new drugs that we currently have now approved. What I try to emphasize is that in all situations, even if you're on the control arm, a patient who participates in a phase 3 randomized placebo-controlled trial will get the current best standard of care, even if they're in the control arm. That is what is required from Health Canada, from internal review boards, to be a part of the trial design. So you will always get the best standard of care, and that will be delivered very carefully by a team of experts. But in order to have the highest level of confidence or evidence that truly this new drug, which could be very expensive, could have some toxicities, is actually performing better, it is necessary in some situations to have placebos and to basically document in the same patient population who are treated with the same standard of care how this new drug is performing. And so I don't have, I think it sometimes is a matter of what sort of the level of risk you're prepared to accept this. So, for example, if there's a new drug candidate that's being developed and you decide, okay, I'm going to participate in this phase 1 trial. Now, you would be getting a drug that's now just in the process of being developed. It might have the highest scientific sort of level of rationale because it's made use of all of the scientific data that's come up to this date, but it hasn't been in the clinic. So you may have the chance to get involved in a drug 10 years before it's available to the general population, but there's added risk because it's just beginning clinical development. but everyone's going to get that drug. So are you the type of person who wants to make sure that you get the drug, but take a little bit more risk on whether that drug is actually helpful? Or do you want to make sure that you get the best standard of care and possibly, in addition, your new drug, which may be 10 years older because it started in the clinic 10 years previously or half a dozen years previously? I think that placebo-controlled trials are necessary, and I don't think there's any downside. The only downside is that you may not have the new drug, but you're certainly going to get the best standard of care.
Okay, great. Thank you for addressing that concern. And just finally, very briefly, we just had one question related to how the Canadian landscape, I guess, with clinical trials compares globally. Are we kind of on par with maybe some of the other larger countries in terms of starting up trials and recruiting? Are we a little further behind? Just a brief description of where we are sort of in the global landscape for clinical trials.
Well, fortunately, we have several very strong features that help Canada become a very strong player in the clinical trials arena. So the CCTG has been a cooperative group that has participated in global clinical trials and has initiated global clinical trials of their own, and has been a strong player in some of the areas such as myeloma, lymphoma, and so I think that that's a strength of our country. One of the weaknesses, perhaps, is that sometimes pharmaceutical-driven trials of very promising agents come to Canada a little later because there's a much bigger market, and whenever a drug comes to Canada, it has to go through all of the regulatory steps, and that adds to the, I guess, the expense of drug development. But I think it's also appreciated that there is a very significant market in Canada, and if a pharmaceutical company wants to get a drug developed, it has to do clinical trials here. So we have lots of clinical trials. We have clinical trials that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. We have investigator-sponsored clinical trials, and we have, as I said, the cooperative group trials. And I think we're a leader in some areas. You can't expect to be a leader in all areas, but I think we're pulling our weight, and I think that we can be proud of the quality of medicine and clinical trial development in Canada.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berenstein. It's a big thanks to leaders like you as well in the field that lead some of these trial sites across the country. So I think that's all the time we have for today. I just wanted to thank Dr. Berenstein for taking the time to share his expertise with us, and also thank everyone in the audience who attended. If you did have any questions that we were unable to answer, please feel free to reach out to us via info@lymphoma.ca, or you can send in your questions through our website. As a reminder, we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website to be used as a resource. Please feel free to watch it again if there was something you missed, or if a friend, family member, or colleague was unable to join live today, they can of course then watch this at their convenience. And you will also be sent an email later this evening with the link to watch the recording. We hope you learned a lot from this presentation. Continue to use Lymphoma Canada as a resource for education and support. You can watch the recording of all of our webinars and educational forums on our website by going to lymphoma.ca and accessing the educational webinars and forums page, which is located under the resource tab. As Dr. Berenstein mentioned in his talk, we do have a section on our website related to clinical trials, and we will be working on updating this in the upcoming month with more information specific to clinical trials for lymphoma patients. As a final thank you, we greatly appreciate your time and expertise today, Dr. Berenstein, and thank you greatly for sharing details about clinical trials with the lymphoma community. Thank you as well for our audience who attended and asked your questions, and thank you for joining everyone. I hope you have a great evening and stay safe. Goodbye now.